Hello everyone, my name is Phil Sexton. I'm the Executive Director of the North Lake Tahoe Historic Society, but I'm also a historian and consultant for the 1882 Foundation. This slide deck discusses a proposal for a National Historic Landmark related to the Chinese camps at Donner Pass connected with construction of the Central Pacific Railroad in the 1860s. And this presentation is recorded on September 6th, 2021. Donner Pass is layered with many layers of human history, and it has international significance as a gateway and connection to and from California and the United States in the 19th century. So some of the historic elements here include Native American prehistory, history related to the immigrant period in the 1840s and 1850s, the Comstock influences connected with the silver discovery in Nevada in 1858 until the 1870s, the railroad period between 1865 and the mid-20th century, highways for automobiles from 1913 to the present, and of course tourism in the 20th and 21st centuries. Each era's activity has modified previous human evidence and left its own unique mark on the landscape. And this is a good example here. In the center of the photo, you can easily see the roadbed of the Central Pacific Railroad constructed in the 1860s. In the center, there's a granite knob, and below that granite knob, you can see a curving road that's notched into the side of that. And that's a 20th century portion that was constructed during the Lincoln Highway period in about 1914. And then in the foreground, there's a sharp-edged granite boulder, and that's blast evidence from the construction of Highway 40 circa 1922-1923. Highway 40 is today's Donner Pass Road, by the way. Human history begins here with the Martis people as long as 4,000 years before the present, and the evidence that they left behind is in the form of petroglyphs. The petroglyphs are very old. They may be 4,000 years old, and they're very faint, but they have been identified, and there's several hundred marks there, and kind of unique to petroglyph sites, there's a marker there that helps you understand them a little bit. If you do visit the site, please avoid walking or tracing the petroglyphs and help preserve them for future visitors, please. In the 1840s, American immigrants first crossed the pass into Mexican California, and the first known group was the Stevens, Townsend, Murphy Party in the fall of 1844. In a certain way, similar to the Donner Party of 1846, members of the Stevens Party were trapped by deep snows, but they were west of the pass at a place called Big Bend. But unlike the Donner Party, they cooperated together. They stayed close. They helped each other out. They all survived. And in fact, at Big Bend during that entrapment, as well as in the previous July, there were births along the way. So the Stevens Party actually arrived in California with 2 more members than they started with, which is really, really remarkable. Before and during the gold rush, immigrants came to California across this pass as well as other passes. And the Donner Pass area was not as heavily used as some others because it's a little bit more rugged and more difficult, and really required in some cases you to disassemble your wagons and lift things up over vertical obstructions before you could continue. In the 1860s, partly because of the Comstock Silver Strike and the coming of the Pacific Railroad, a wagon road was constructed all the way from Dutch Flat to near Truckee called the Dutch Flat Donner Lake Wagon Road. And this is a early photo that shows it crossing Donner Pass. In the foreground, you can see its curve. At the time, it was a toll road, and it made a lot of money for the people that owned the toll road because it was so busy at this time. The Chinese were first employed on the railroad near the town of Auburn, about 65 miles west of Donner Pass, at a place called Bloomer Cut. This is what Bloomer Cut looks like today, and it's a cut through this hill that was on the Bloomer Ranch, which is why it has that name. But it was the first place where the railroad had to use black powder to move dirt, because the cobbles that you see are ancient river gravels, and they are cemented together, and they are very, very hard, so they actually broke picks and shovels, and they had to use black powder to create this cut. But more importantly for our story, it's the first place where Chinese were employed on the Central Pacific Railroad. And that's because there was a chronic labor shortage in California. Some of it related to the Civil War. Thousands of California men went back east to fight for the Union Army during the Civil War. But also because the railroad wages were not very high, and white people would not work for the wages they paid. So reluctantly, the Central Pacific made a decision here to hire Chinese people that lived in Auburn, and they were underemployed and willing to work for the wages. And there's a story that's probably apocryphal, but Charlie Crocker went to the board of the Central Pacific Railroad and suggested this, and they said, no, these people are too small, they can't do the work. And Mr. Crocker is said to have replied, they built the Great Wall of China, didn't they? They can do this. But they were first hired here at Bloomer Cut as mere laborers to move material as it had been blasted out. But quickly they did good work, and by the end of the year, the railroad was hiring thousands and thousands of Chinese workers. They became the dominant labor force, comprising up to 90% of the workforce on the Central Pacific Railroad. This is payroll sheet number 102 for March 1865 for the Central Pacific Railroad, and it's one of just a few sheets that actually shows Chinese names on a payroll. So you see Ah Yao, Ah Tong, Ah Yao again, and so on and so forth. But I have to admit I'm a little confused as to how this is laid out, because it says names, and under occupation there are other American names, and I suspect that because of the discriminatory practices at the time, the actual gold or scrip or pay was given to the people named under occupation to be given to the laborers. I just have to admit I just don't quite understand that. But this is also just one of a very few payroll records that show Chinese names on the railroad, and that's because early on, as they ramped up and hired hundreds and then thousands of Chinese workers, the railroad didn't hire them directly. They worked through labor brokers. The Six Companies was one, Sisson and Wallace was another. And these brokers actually recruited in China. They went through parts of California to bring people on. So the Central Pacific actually paid the brokers for labor. And it was the laborers who paid the Chinese directly, which is why that there are so few records that the railroad records hold that show Chinese names. One reason that so many Chinese came to California starting in the gold rush was because of the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion was a 14-year-long civil war with 20 million fatalities. It was an awful and bloody conflict. And it was a rebellion of the Taiping movement against the Qing Dynasty, attempting to overthrow the Qing Dynasty and introduce a new form of government with a particular type of Christianity, but more democratic ideals. Ultimately, the rebellion failed, but it weakened the Qing Dynasty in such a way that ultimately they collapsed at the end of the 19th century. Additionally, in China at this time, there was also terrible famine and great unhappiness and great terror. So tens of thousands, at least, of Chinese people went around the Pacific Rim, went to Central and South America, and many hundreds and perhaps thousands came to California during the gold rush. I've seen census records for the city of Auburn in 1850, and 1/3 of the residents of Auburn at that time were actually Chinese, and this was the height of the gold rush. But by the 1860s, there's just a few left in Auburn, and these were the people that the Central Pacific Railroad hired. Most of the railroad workers that came from China came from the Guangzhou province at the Pearl River Delta, and this is a map that shows that. You can see Hong Kong and Macau for reference there. And they would come from little villages up near the top of the Pearl River and come by ship to California. Now, this part of China is subtropical. It's humid, it rains a lot, it's hot, it's uncomfortable for many people. It's quite a bit different environment than California. Another reason that people left China and came to other places was because of the Second Opium War. The Second War involved British and French colonialism and the armed forces of those countries, and honestly a little bit of American influence as well, to reestablish the opium trade that had been prohibited by a previous treaty. But the lure of money from the opium trade was irresistible to these capitalists, and ultimately they succeeded and perpetuated some of the horrors of opium addiction. But it was legal at the time, and this war also resulted in the transfer of Hong Kong and Kowloon to the British for a 99-year lease that ended in the late 20th century. But back to Donner Pass, when people left the Guangzhou province and came across the Pacific, they came to San Francisco and then got on a smaller ship that came to the port at Sacramento. And from there, they signed some papers and boarded a train that took them to wherever the end of track was. And by the time you got up here to Donner Pass at 7,200 feet, you're in an alpine environment with thin air, a very different climate than Asia, snow that often lasts into midsummer, and desperately cold and very snowy and very windy winters. There's always a wind at Donner Pass. This photo is from a good water year. This is early summer that still shows a lot of snow on site in mid or late June. And in this area from 1865 to 1867, thousands of Chinese workers built a railroad bed, including several tunnels, using black powder hand tools. And the asterisk reminds me that for a time in Tunnel 6 and Tunnel 7, they also used newly invented nitroglycerin, which was a much more efficient explosive but incredibly dangerous. And with both black powder and nitroglycerin, as well as exposure, avalanches, and other causes, we don't know how many people were injured or killed in accidents up here because records were not kept, but we know that there were fatalities and very serious injuries during this construction. Railroad construction is a hazardous occupation. It is still hazardous today, but much safer than it was, of course, in the 1860s. This is Tunnel 6 looking in the west portal, and when it was built in the 1860s, it was the highest elevation, and it's 1,654 feet, the longest railroad tunnel ever built. It is one of the remarkable things that happened in America in the 19th century. At the site, there's ample evidence of construction still today. This shows basically half of a drill hole and half of a portion of a drill hole. Holes were drilled into the granite rock of the tunnel faces up to 4 feet deep, sometimes a little deeper, and that would often take a day or more, filled with black powder or nitroglycerin, and then shot. And they planned the whole locations and the whole depth and everything else to cleave along seams in the rock. So this shows the seam that it was cleaved along, as well as it breaking in other places. This is just a portion of a very deep hole. It shows half of it. And it's easy to find these things if you know what you're looking for at the roadbed. Union Pacific still owns the abandoned roadbed that crosses the pass, even though it was detracked in 1993. They claim that it's necessary for truck access to other parts where there's still railroad track and that they need to do work. But the whole area is a major site of exploration and wonder, and much of the surrounding area is national forest land. As visitation explodes, people such as myself have become increasingly concerned about damage to these resources, not only looting, but vandalism such as this tagging. And I think this is really awful and sad. This is the bottom of one of the blast holes that has at least 2 layers and perhaps more layers of damaging graffiti on top of it. And unfortunately, in addition to it being ugly, it covers some of the patina that was left there by the Chinese. And because of the paint, you can't see the pattern in the rock that shows the actual blast pattern of this particular hole. To me, it's a real abomination on very precious resources. And one of the reasons that we favor a national landmark designation is hopefully to provide a greater level of protection for this site. But groups such as the United States-China Railroad Friendship Association, the Chinese Railroad Workers Descendants Groups, the UC Davis History Project, the 1882 Foundation, the Forest Service, and others are helping to raise awareness and knowledge of the importance of the place. So this is a photo from, I think, a 2019 tour that we took up to the site with Railroad Workers Descendants, sponsored by the United States-China Railroad Friendship Association. And you can see off to the right members of the staff of Tahoe National Forest that we're very grateful to, as well as some members of the 1882 Foundation. The UC Davis History Project also got grants to present 7 years of teacher education intensive weeks called Teaching the Transcontinental Railroad, in cooperation with the Railroad Museum when I was there, and later the 1882 Foundation. These programs were a week long, and teachers would come into Sacramento and spend a week learning about the history, having lectures from professors and book authors. On the day I was involved in, we would take them up to Donner and a couple of other places to be on the ground and actually be able to see and touch and explore some of these really, really important places. And as a result, the teachers would construct curriculum suitable for their high school history classes and other groups about bringing the Chinese story into this important history. Oddly enough, at the same time, we started to see an increase in films and documentaries about this. Perhaps the most well-known one was Hell on Wheels, a drama, really a Western with the railroad in it, about building the Transcontinental Railroad, that aired on the AMC networks from 2012 to 2017, I think, and it currently streams on Netflix. I do want to point out that this was a fine show, but it is fiction. And although some of the names are familiar and they did build a railroad, it is not to be viewed as a history lesson, but still the cultural things related to the Chinese characters in here are actually pretty accurate and very respectful to the Chinese. It's also a fun show to watch. And I'll admit my bias. For the last 3 seasons, I was a consultant on the show, and I was very happy to be involved with that. But more to the actual history, PBS has done several things, including an episode of a show called Tough Trains, which aired in 2017. The BBC, which also airs on PBS, did an episode of Great American Railway Journeys in season 2, an episode called Reno to Colfax, where they explored this area, as well as some other really interesting things related to the Transcontinental Railroad and the history of the area. It's well worth a watch if you can find it. It is sometimes difficult to find online. In 2018 and airing in 2019, PBS did an episode of 10 Modern Marvels That Changed America. This was Engineering Marvels, and one of the segments was on the Transcontinental Railroad, and it too is a really fine piece of work. But perhaps the best one for me for completeness and detail is actually a French television show that was called Masters of Railway Engineering. And they were nice enough to do an English dub that's available on YouTube, and the original French is available on Vimeo. The host, Matthew Barreau, there in the center frame, is a professor of engineering in a university in Paris, and he's also a sketch artist. And so he approached several things related to railway engineering with a unique perspective, because he's an engineer who understands it, but he's also an artist who is available to communicate these things well. And the Transcontinental Railroad portion is just a segment of an hour-long show. The whole show is interesting, but he did, and his crew did a really wonderful job. And if I understand correctly, the episode won the equivalent of a French Emmy Award for documentaries. Currently on YouTube is a film produced by Joe Flannery of the U.S. Forest Service called Legacy, and it explores the legacy of the Chinese history at this site, but also kind of expands that into efforts that the Forest Service is currently making to be more inclusive of the history of people of color and to do a better job in presenting and preserving these histories. It's quite a nice film, about 21 minutes long, and I think you'd enjoy it. In May 2019, I was invited to Washington, D.C. to participate in a Transcontinental Railroad colloquialism sponsored by the 1882 Foundation, held at the Smithsonian Museum of American History. And it was a remarkable event. But what was really wonderful, for me at least, was a reception at the Library of Congress with the Congressional Asian Caucus, where this national monument idea was discussed. And this is when I really started to get an idea that this was an actual possibility that might actually come to fruition. But back to Donner Pass, some of the important things of the site. If you look at this slide, in the upper left corner is a little piece of Donner Lake. And then just to the right of that, you can see the concrete roof of Tunnel 7, a little bit of snow in the background of Tunnel 8. But right in the center of the photo is a flat area, and that's a building foundation. This is one of the archaeological sites that most people don't find. And I can't tell you which building it is, but it's one of the buildings in this Alfred Heart photo from 1867. This cluster of buildings was shops and barracks and equipment and other things related to the railroad. In the background, the hill that you see in the back is today part of Donner Ski Ranch. The granite ridge in the middle, just on the other side, is a little dip there, and that's where Donner Pass Road is today, the former Highway 40. And then the curved road in the foreground is the curve of the Dutch Flat Donner Lake Wagon Road. Today, it's not really possible to duplicate this view because so many more trees have come in and grown up that the road is certainly obscured, but the granite view remains much the same, and I'm hoping at some point in the future that I will actually rephotograph this view. This is a little closer in the archaeological site today, and it may not look like much to most people, but that arc of rocks is certainly of human origin, and this has been interpreted as a hearth site where cooking occurred. And if you look closely at the rocks in detail, you can still see blackened rocks from all the fires that were there and find things related to life and human activity there. On some occasions, when I take groups up to the site or explore it, I can find absolute human evidence of this. And in the left-hand frame, there are Chinese or pottery fragments, ceramic fragments, that are either from a teacup or a rice bowl that show parts of a double happiness pattern, much as you might see in a Chinese restaurant today. In the right-hand frame is a coin that's from the Qing Dynasty. So this perhaps fell out of a worker's pocket, perhaps it was used in a gambling game and left aside as one of the tokens, but it was lost over time. Now, when I go up there, and if you actually explore sites like this or any site with cultural influence in it, if you find things like this, be sure and photograph them. Sketch them, do whatever you'd like with them, but please leave them on site. On public lands, it's actually a crime to remove them. But perhaps more importantly, these are pieces of a very complex jigsaw puzzle, and if you've ever had a puzzle that's missing a piece, it's frustrating because you never see the complete picture. By leaving these pieces, it allows scientists who study these things and others to have the chance of discovery and wonder that you have when you find them. So please, never remove things from public lands and return them as you found them. In these cases, I actually bury them, and perhaps they turn up again later, perhaps they don't, but we know that they're there, and people much more experienced than you or I have the chance to study and learn from these things. This is perhaps the best known cultural feature of the area. This is China Wall. It's about a 75-foot tall dry-laid stone wall, and dry-laid means that there's no mortar used. The blocks are locked together in an intricate interlocking pattern to keep them strong and stacked. The wall actually is not vertical, it leans back at about 10 degrees, and behind it is the roadbed for the railroad. So for 130 years, from 1867 to 1993, this supported railroads. It supported locomotives and cars and passengers and all sorts of goods that came across to and from California across this route. And it would still do the job today, but in 1993, due to a slowdown in traffic and a number 2 track that's a little bit south of this, this section was detracked and no longer carries railroad cargoes. In the inset in the lower right, you can see one of the quarried blocks that was squared and prepared for this wall, but for reasons that I don't know, it was cast aside, but it still shows the human influence that helped create this wall. The picture on the left is one of the few images that you'll probably ever see of the inside of the center shaft of the Summit Tunnel. This was from a time when we visited there with a TV crew and they had lots of strong lights, so there was enough light to take a good picture with my camera. The upper right photo shows the top of the center shaft. The concrete frame around it dates from the 19th century, and the steel cover over it dates from the 20th century. It was put there, I think, to keep people from falling in. But prior to the whole cover going on there, if you look in the lower right corner, there was a grid work of old pieces of rail there, and they left the cover open to vent out the exhaust of locomotives. First wood smoke, and then coal and oil smoke, and then diesel smoke as locomotives went through and helped provide some fresh air into that very long tunnel. If you go to the site and look closely around the perimeter of it, you can even see stud bolts that were used to attach a steam boiler that was used as a hoist to lower and raise men and equipment and waste rock from the shaft as it was first dug and then as the tunnel was dug inside. And then nearby you can see piles of the waste rock that were cast aside as that shaft was created and the tunnel was dug. And then there's this. In 2020, a community group did a lot of work up there, and one of the things that they did was they graded and they laid a paved path from a parking area to the center shaft. And I have to admit my personal frustration and disappointment with this, but this is just my own opinion. In creating this path, they made this accessible for wheelchairs, which I suppose is a worthy thing. But I really don't believe that every archaeological site should have 100% access for everyone to it. And in this case, by laying the subbed and then paving over this, they moved and probably destroyed some of the archaeological evidence because there was a wagon road spur that came in from the left to this spot. And by encouraging more use here, I think it encourages vandalism and tagging and theft of resources. So I don't have a connection to this, but I think it's unfortunate that this much work was done here. Now I want to start out this slide with telling you that this National Landmark graphic was prepared in July 2020. That's more than a year ago. And the boundary shown in red is not a current boundary for a national landmark. And that's because in our discussions with Union Pacific so far, they have told us that they do not wish to have any of the railroad bed included in a national landmark. And our discussions with them continue, but out of deference to their ownership and their wishes, the current proposal focuses on the campsites and not the roadbed. But it's still an interesting map and it shows the area pretty well. This is a Google Earth image in case you're interested. And the numbers refer to significant cultural features here. Number one is actually some old 1920s buildings that say that it's least assurable resort. It was originally a highway maintenance station when that was the U.S. highway, and it was last used as a private school. Currently, the main building is not in use. In site number 2, the blue line shows the Pacific Crest Trail trending from Mexico to Canada as it crosses the site. Feature number 3 shows Donner Pass Road, which until the 1960s was U.S. Highway 40. Feature number 4 shows the Native American Petroglyph site, which is very close to Highway 40 or Donner Pass Road, and you can park right there and walk up to it. And then just down the road from that is feature number 5, which it says Summit Trailhead China Wall Turnout. And China Wall Turnout is a turnout in the summer with a portable restroom there that is mainly created for rock climbing that happens in the area. There's actually a rock face called China Wall that is not the cultural China Wall, but it's a very popular Class 3 and Class 4 rock climbing slope. And it's also a good place to park and start an exploration to explore this site from the bottom part. Feature number 6 actually indicates the orange line. It's a little misplaced, but the orange line is the Dutch Flat Road, and in the early 20th century, the Lincoln Highway, which was the first transcontinental automobile route for travel in the early 20th century. The red boundary, as I've mentioned before, was a proposal for a National Historic Landmark. It is not the current proposal, but there actually hasn't been a boundary proposal made yet for this current iteration. Now here's what a National Historic Landmark designation is designed to do. It provides national recognition from the National Park Service, which constitutes endorsement of the importance of the site by the people of the United States. And it results in greater visibility connected with tourism, education, and scholarly research for the site, which is sorely needed. I've mentioned that it provides some oomph, but what I really mean is some gravitas to help acquire grants and public support to help further the work and the interpretation that would be done there. And a designation of a national landmark is really marketable for the hospitality and adventure sectors. It's a good economic inducement for everyone. Here's what a National Historic Landmark designation doesn't do. It doesn't compromise anyone's private property rights. Unfortunately, it doesn't provide any funding or staffing. It doesn't replace or nullify any local efforts related to the site. It doesn't create any new bureaucracy. And it doesn't obscure or diminish any of the other historic events and times that are connected with Donner Pass. And that's really important because there's so much crucial American history that is concentrated right in this small area. So for several years now, the 1882 Foundation has been having discussions with major stakeholders, including the Union Pacific Railroad, the U.S. Forest Service, Sugar Bowl Ski Area, and the National Park Service. And in 2021, the Park Service has funded an archaeological study that's being done right now. And their historic landmarks representative back east had planned a site visit in 2020. That had to be canceled because of the pandemic, but of course we're still hoping that she'll come out and visit and understand the site. But we've been talking interactively with her, and she's enthusiastic about the project. This year, I learned that a National Geographic photographer, Phil Chung, is doing a photo essay for the magazine about the geography of the Transcontinental Railroad, scheduled for publication in 2023. And of course, the significance and the beauty of Donner Pass will be certainly a part of that photo essay. And so I'm really looking forward to that. And we've been able to supply him with some information and some resources to help him with that. So right now, my job, let me back up for a second. I forgot to mention in this presentation that also in June, this area was named as one of the 11 most endangered historic sites by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is another really important designation that helps us communicate all of these things better. But it also tells you really the danger of uncontrolled development and damage to the site. So part of my job, since all of that has happened, is to talk with local stakeholders and work more closely with people on the ground. And the stakeholders typically include adjacent property owners, local historic and cultural societies, county supervisors, local legislators, and other local governmental agencies, and others with a significant interest, which is one reason why we're doing these presentations. The intent of the conversations is for us to listen and learn with goals that include not only the protection and purpose for the site, but also local input and to help encourage localized management. Letters of support from stakeholders is also really, really important. Ideally, what the 1882 Foundation would like to see is an active on-site presence of people who are knowledgeable, good interpreters, and those who share a love and respect for the site, doing monitoring, research, presentations to help share accurate information and provide high-quality interpretation to visitors literally from around the world. There would be partnerships with universities, historic groups and museums, as well as community groups, all targeted to protection and preservation, as well as sharing knowledge and learning new things related to the Chinese and American history here that helps increase understanding and appreciation for the place and its significance. And people ask, how can I help? Well, a letter of support is really helpful. And if you write a letter of support to the 1882 Foundation, it will help support the nomination to the National Park Service for this National Historic Landmark. Spread the word with people you know who are interested. Railroad nuts, historians, students, all sorts of people. Spread the word because this is such an important area and this is such a key part of this grander history of the whole history of the Sierra Nevada. If you have connections with local influencers or politicians, talk to them about your support for the project. If you have specific questions or if you'd like to visit the site, I'm happy to go up there with you as best I can. My email address is here in the presentation, but in case I haven't mentioned it earlier, it's Sexton, Sexton, at gmail.com. And I'm more than happy to talk with you about this. So with that, I'll close right now. Thank you for your time, and thank you for caring about these important historic places. Appreciate it.